Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are when you tune in. A warm welcome to Trade Winds. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I'm a senior fellow non-resident at Peterson Institute, and I will be hosting Trade Winds once a month after Annabel Gonzalez, who left us to become Deputy Secretary General at the WTO. She will be back, however, occasionally as a guest host. I have the enormous pleasure to have with us today a very special guest, the Managing Director of IMF, Mrs. Kristalina Georgieva, who is a good friend and a former colleague of mine from Brussels, but who is also one of the most visible persons who have engaged on a global platform during this crisis. And we will be talking about this. She is right now the head of IMF since October 2019. Before joining, she was also the CEO of the World Bank for 2.5 years, serving 3 months as interim president. Previously, she has served in the European Commission, first Commissioner for International Cooperation, Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Response, and after that, as a Vice President for Budget and Human Resources. Her CV is very long, but I'll stop there, just underlining that she has a very vast leadership experience from multilateral and international organizations, and also handling big budgets. And for full disclosure, as I said, we were colleagues from Brussels in the European Commission for 7 years. Kristalina, it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Oh.
The IMF has, of course, played a very important role during the pandemic, and I know you've supported member states widely in different ways. And I want us to talk about the recovery, what comes after the pandemic, but this is, of course, so much related to the vaccine and the rollout of vaccines globally, our ability to handle different variants and mutations of the virus. And the global vaccination rate is going very fast in some countries, but it is so uneven in many parts of the world. And many developing countries are in acute lack of vaccines. I know that the IMF has engaged with WTO, the World Bank, and COVAX to call for a global vaccine campaign. And certainly the economic crisis cannot be over until the health crisis is over, so they are very interlinked. So it is in our common interest that the whole world gets vaccinated. No one is safe until everyone is safe. And I know that you have called for G7 countries and others to donate vaccines. They have, but of course it's not enough. And I know that the IMF has engaged a lot of this, and you have issued a pandemic paper. Is this something you could tell us a little bit about?
Thank you very much, Cecilia. Congratulations for taking over a fantastic monthly engagement on trade. I have watched Annabel running it. I have no doubt that you would bring the same drive and energy on a topic that matters tremendously for what the world economy would look like after the pandemic and how it looks like during the pandemic. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to be a guest. And let me go straight to your question. The world economy was hit very hard last year. It shrank. The most significant percentage in peacetime since the Great Depression, and it is now striving to recover. And we know now convincingly that this recovery hinges on 2 things. One, determination to provide support through monetary policy accommodation and fiscal measures until we are on the other side. And 2, determination to bring the pandemic to an end, for which vaccinations are critical. So our institution looks at vaccinations as economic policy this year, likely next year. And in fact, we put it at par, if not even above in some countries, the traditional macroeconomic policies. Why? Because unless we succeed to get through the pandemic as a global community, it would continue to hold the recovery back. So what is in the plan that our staff proposed? It is built on a credible evidence that when vaccination levels go above 40, 50, 60%, that provides a durable platform for recovery. So we call for the world to mobilize and vaccinate each and every country to 40% at least this year and to 60% by the middle of next year. And we have studied carefully the viability of this proposal. The answer is it is possible. And it would take $50 billion in financing and a strong international cooperation. So to break it down, the 50 billion need to provide, obviously, for the vaccines themselves, combined with donations from countries that have surplus vaccines, we can credibly reach the targets I outlined. We also need money to expand production beyond what currently is the projected level. We say we need about 11 billion doses, but we actually need more. Why? Because we might be pressured to use boosters that may be necessary, and also because when we are vaccinating people in developing countries, the level of loss of vaccines is higher. Their health systems are less equipped to handle the sophistication of vaccinations. We need money to help vials to turn into shots in the arm. In other words, help poor countries with the logistics and delivery of vaccines. And last but not least, we need money because between now and the time people are vaccinated at the required level, we still need testing and contact tracing and PPEs and oxygen and therapeutics. So when we put this package, it was so very obvious that the price tag, 50 billion, as significant as it may be, dwarfs in comparison with the economic benefits, which we calculate in the order of $9 trillion of additional output between now and 2025. And on top of it, we looked into what is this $99 trillion meaning for advanced economies? Well, advanced economies would get 40% of it, and part of their benefit is $1 trillion in additional tax revenues, just because the economy is perking up and it is delivering more. Very clearly, the economic logic is there, but beyond the economic logic, Cecilia, it is our common humanity, the ethical logic. It is not right to have people dying unnecessarily because we have not done the cooperation required to bring this pandemic to an end, to protect lives and protect livelihoods. And let me finish with a word on trade. In this plan, trade plays a very significant role. And this is why Dr. Ngozi endorsed it and is a big part of the solution we are pursuing. Trade contributes first by eliminating restrictions and providing facilitation for the delivery of vaccines and the necessary supplies to produce vaccines, as well as therapeutics and oxygen and all the rest. Trade matters by bringing manufacturers for a concerted effort together with policymakers and trade authorities. And I want to praise WTO for doing that. But also trade discussions matter because there is a understandable demand from developing countries for a broader platform to produce vaccines in more places, and negotiations are intensifying on potentially a very narrowly defined waiver of intellectual property for this to happen. And I want to congratulate everybody in WTO who has been, especially Dr. Ngozi, as a former chair of Gavi. She knows so much about this topic for working hard on all these three fronts, eliminating barriers, providing a platform for discussions with manufacturers and policymakers in the WTO, and working on potentially a very narrowly defined intellectual property waiver in the context of fighting this pandemic and pandemics in the future.
Yes, the pandemic has certainly also given a possibility for new types of cooperation and has reinforced cooperation between international organizations in a way that we haven't seen before. And the whole process of getting vaccines has been quick and also subject to a very rarely seen type of international cooperation, which is, of course, something we should learn from in the future. And you talk about $50 billion, that's a huge amount of money, but the alternative is, of course, costs so much more. And we have an economic but also moral responsibility to do that. How do you, we've also seen, I mean, lots of people talk about this, and there has been quite generous gifts of vaccine to the world, and that is to be welcomed, of course. But there's also been export restrictions and protectionist tendencies in the past. It's easing up now, and these waiver, even if it's going to be very limited, is of course subject also to a lot of discussions. How and G7 meeting didn't really land in a grandiose declaration of help. It was rather modest in my view. How do you see this plan that you have together with COVAX and WTO? How is it going? How is it being received by the rich countries who needs to do the work?
What we are seeing is very promising progress on all counts of what we are advocating for. We have seen stepped up efforts by COVAX. They increased their target, and I welcome that very much, to 30% for this year. And most importantly, they secured the funding to reach the target of 30%. We have seen progress in surplus countries donating doses to deficit countries. We continue to urge as much as possible to do that in a coordinated manner, so we are as efficient as possible. The African Union has stepped up, and there has been quite a lot of coordinated effort through the African Union as well as through COVAX. And we have seen on the trade front more positive steps than the opposite, the negative. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, the G20 economies reported 140 new trade measures. 101, or 72%, were actually trade facilitating measures, making it easier for health supplies to reach out the right destination. 39 or 28%, 39 measures, so this is 28%, were restrictive measures, and they were actually export bans, which is a very harmful way if it is to be sustained. Now, on surface, it looks like there was more positive than negative. Actually, if you translate it into volumes of trade affected, it is just about the same: 100 billion facilitation, 100 billion restriction. Good news is that half of these restrictive measures have been eliminated. And obviously, I joined Dr. Ngozi in calling for eliminating restrictions overall. Now, these are all positive steps, but we still have a way to go, and we have to inject a sense of urgency. We saw how the Delta variant roams around the world and hits countries with weaker health systems dramatically. We probably would see other variants. And even if we don't, it is so clear that we are on the pace we are today, not going to end the pandemic as timely as it is necessary. In other words, by the end of next year. Now, why am I urging for speed? Because if we are to speed up, it would cost the same money, but it would have a bigger impact. And that is why my call today and every day is lean forward. Countries that have surplus vaccines, don't wait for when you have already vaccinated all your people, but predict how your plans would go and give an early indication of what you are able to do. And for closing the funding gap, there is still need for more grants. What became very pressing, Cecilia, are two specific actions. One, emergency packages of oxygen, PPEs, therapeutics for countries that are being hit by the new variant, especially poor countries. We have to make sure that they get the support to prevent avoidable loss of life. And secondly, what is becoming very clear today is that September, October, November, December, we are going to see more doses released from advanced economies to go to the developing world. And then making sure that countries can make use of these doses, that they have the facilities, they have the necessary cooling capacity, and they have the campaigns to mobilize people to vaccinate. This is going to be an impediment unless we deal with it now. And that is why I'm keen to see that more stepped up donation of vaccines and money is done now, not later.
No, there's certainly an urgency there, and I think many of us can support that plea, definitely. And I know that IMF and your team has been very active in also trying to provide funds and debt relief and special programs to the member states. And I read in an article in Financial Times that the IMF is starting to sound like a development agency or a charity foundation. And I would imagine that you think that is a compliment rather than an insult. But it is, of course, very, very much linked. If we don't deal with the health crisis, we cannot deal with the economic crisis. And you mentioned the Delta variant. There will possibly be others taking us by surprise. So the crisis is definitely not over. But even so, there are some positive signs in the end of the tunnel. And the European Union published a quite optimistic growth forecast for an average of 4.8% next year. And I think you in the IMF, you said that globally the figure is 6%, in the US 7%, and then of course it varies between the country. We know that the recovery is very uneven and that it is linked to what you call the true track recovery, of course. But what is your assessment of the economic outlook, provided that the vaccine rollout and that the global trading system helps the rollout of the vaccine, and that rich countries continue to be generous and assist the whole world in giving vaccine, and the infrastructure also to give those vaccines to the citizens?
When the history of this crisis is written, I would expect that there would be quite a lot of positive reflection on what has been done in a synchronized manner to prevent a recession turning into depression. And I want to pay tribute to the central bankers and the finance authorities that have very quickly assessed what this crisis is all about. And actually our staff at the IMF as well. What has been done, in fact, reduced the depth of the recession 3 times. It would have been 3 times worse without the nearly $28 trillion of fiscal measures and very, very effective policy accommodation. On top of it, we have the scientists that have delivered vaccines in record short time, and the ability of the world to mobilize to bring the pandemic to an end. Those 2 things, they're working for the world economy. And despite the fact that, of course, the new Delta variant is giving us a bit of pause, what we are projecting is a remarkable recovery in 2021. However, the 6% that we are projecting for the world was 6% in April. It is 6% in July. But between April and July, the composition of this 6% has changed. Some countries are now projected to grow faster. Some countries are projected to grow slower. What is the difference? It is primarily speed and effectiveness of vaccinations and availability of fiscal space to act. This is why we are pressing as economic policy to pursue vaccinations everywhere. And this is why we as institutions are there for our members to provide fiscal space for countries that are most severely restricted. In this crisis, the IMF has done more for the membership we have than ever in our history. We have provided financial lifelines and support to 86 countries. And we are continuing to pursue with the membership remarkable action. And again, you know, very often we talk about, oh, fragmentation, there is no political will to act globally. But here we are with our members agreeing to support $650 billion special drawing rights allocation to boost reserves and to create this fiscal space where it is lacking. And on top of it, our well-off members, those with strong reserves, are willing to on-lend some of their new SDRs to countries that are in dire need of more help. And I expect that we will see a significant amount. The G7 came up with an ambition of $100 billion. I hope this would materialize. So we amplify the contribution of this new allocation for the members, for the countries that are in a more severe need. And let me finish again on the note of there is spirit of collaboration. It may be, yes, we need more. There is no question about it. But I think we have to recognize and give credit where credit is due. Our 4 organizations, the World Bank, WHO, WTO, and the IMF, working with ACT, COVAX, and Gavi, we have created what we call a war room, a place to track down how we are advancing on vaccinations, where are the gaps, why do they exist, how we can close them down. And that is exactly where I think as a world we have to move the strength of the collective in the face of what clearly is going to be more frequent, more devastating shocks future.
Yes, certainly. There's never enough money, but there's a very big difference between countries, as you mentioned, and this is certainly to remain for quite a long time. But there's also a growing gap within countries. And we've seen especially, and that goes for the whole world, the developing world and the developed world, that women have suffered more during the crisis than men. Their service jobs have been lost to a greater extent. Women have taken a larger responsibility for homeschooling and for children who cannot go to school so we will certainly see effects for a very long time on this. I know that you have been calling for an engendering of the budget when countries do their recovery budgets and allocations. Would you like to elaborate on this?
The evidence is very clear. When women are included in the economy, their families, their communities, their countries do better. And it is true that in this crisis, we have seen disproportionate impact. Women, low-skilled workers, young people bearing more the brunt of the crisis. So we have to prioritize more equality in our societies. If we are to be more resilient to future shocks, we have to be more inclusive. And I would put women on the top of this inclusiveness because of the ability of women to make entrepreneurship work better, education deliver higher results. So what we are recommending to our members is to include gender in their budgeting, and we actually find a great deal of interest. We have provided capacity development support to over 110 countries where finance authorities are saying, look, that sounds like a promising thing, how do we do it? I want to praise countries that have advanced a lot in that area, including Sweden, for paving the way, demonstrating what it means to have gender-based budgeting. And what it means is identify what are the investments that are going to increase labor force participation, access to childcare, ability to have flexible work hours. And I praise also here in the United States, the US administration for taking measures in that direction. We know that infrastructure has to ease the way of women to, especially in developing countries, to go to work, to be able to go to work safely, to fetch water for their families. We also know that providing more incentives for girls to get into science early means that they will contribute more to society. And last but not least, financial inclusion. If women can get access to credit, they are proven to be more reliable to pay back. So all these measures, they have to be built in budgets, and countries have a space to learn from each other how to do it better.
I couldn't agree more on this. In my former life as trade commissioner, we tried to put more emphasis on women in trade because there are obstacles, legal obstacles, but also hidden discriminatory obstacles for women to engage in trade. And when they do get access to the global market and to credits and to the networks, they invest, especially in developing countries, they invest the outcomes of this in their families, in their children's education, in their health. So actually it's a way to fight poverty as well, but we still have a long way to go there. And I think the gender differences within and between countries also after the pandemic will remain with us for quite some time. So it's really important to do this in gendering of budget, as you say, also when there's not a crisis. You can send in questions in the Q&A sessions if you have questions for Kristalina. But I also wanted to say that, I mean, this crisis that we are facing is huge, but at the same time, and we see evidence of that. We saw it in Canada, in the US, we see it now in Belgium and in the Netherlands and Germany, floods, devastation, climate issue, and this is an ongoing crisis that cannot be dealt with after the pandemic. It has to be dealt with all the time. And in the trading system, there's increasing calls for trade to take a larger responsibility for the environmental and the sustainable development goals, which is important as well. And in many trade agreements, there are provisions on climate and on sustainable development. And there is a growing international cooperation on this upcoming to the conference in Glasgow, of course. And you probably saw that last week the EU presented the proposal on carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a way to ensure that the price of imports reflect the carbon content. And I think most scientists agree that you need to price or tax carbon. The difference is how and in what form. And without entering into this specific proposal, there is, of course, a discussion on how the world can increasingly cooperate on this. And this is also something that IMF has been dealing with for a long time, both in the light of the pandemic crisis, but also before. How can trade include even more the climate aspects of global interchange?
Thank you for asking this question. Trade has an important role to play. It actually has been playing this role in trade agreements. We have seen in numerous cases the inclusion of sustainability environment chapters. They do play an important role. We saw in the US-Mexico-Canada agreement attention to environment, and it got quite a lot of support. Secondly, there has been some intention to negotiate environmental goods agreement. It was put in the freezer. Hopefully it would come out of the freezer, because if we make it easier for environmental technologies and solutions to flow across borders, that certainly would help with sustainability and the fight against climate change. We have seen countries coming up with proposals for a WTO agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, New Zealand and other countries. This is all very positive and goes in the right direction. And let me touch on the carbon border adjustment tax. We at the IMF have done significant amount of research on how we can reach the Paris Agreement goals. And it is very clear that pricing carbon ought to be part of the solution. Without pricing carbon, we just would not have an incentive in place for businesses and consumers to shift fast enough for us to be able to retain global temperature increase at 1.5 degrees Celsius, or at least below 2 degrees Celsius. So how we go about pricing carbon? We have three ways to do it. The most effective one is the one that Sweden has chosen, tax it. We can also trade. We can have cap and trade. It is also effective, slightly less efficient than tax, but it does the job. And three, we can have regulatory requirements that translate into equivalency of a price. Let's call it shadow carbon pricing. And some countries have chosen this route. Whichever way you go, what matters is to reach the right level of carbon price and predictably drive it up so we can protect our planet and our future. Now, if countries don't do that in a simultaneous manner, then inevitably there would be carbon leakage. And this is why the European Union came up with their proposal for carbon border adjustment, and other countries are talking about it. In our view, it would be best if countries were to move in sync with introducing carbon price and increasing this price. That would make it unnecessary to have border adjustment. But if that is not the case, then border adjustment becomes a necessity from a competitiveness standpoint, and also it offers an incentive to countries to move faster on pricing carbon. Just to give you the numbers where we are today, the world has on average $3 a ton price on carbon. Where we should be by 2030, we should have $75 per ton. The distance we have to travel. And I think that in that process of traveling, the carbon border adjustment discussion becomes a necessity. At the IMF, we made an alternative proposal. We said, how about introducing international carbon price floor in which different categories of countries, richer and poorer, establish a carbon price that is corresponding to their level of development. And that carbon price floor covers around 80% of global emissions. In other words, the big emitters all participate. That would be a way to make it less pressing to seek for trade-related measures or measures that are ultimately going to affect the work of WTO. And let me finish with my deeply held personal view. If we can move towards a pricing carbon in countries at different level of development, rather than creating a world in which there has to be border adjustment and country after country needs to deal with it, we are going to make the life of Dr. Ngozi much easier. And I think that the trade agenda as it is today is complicated and difficult enough. So why not try to find a solution which is more efficient and avoids a new area of potentially trade tensions.
Well, the discussion on this just began, and as you say, they're also discussing it in several other countries as well. And of course, the ideal solution would be a global carbon tax of some kind. And that relates to a question from the audience, it's an anonymous viewer who is asking how the IMF sees your work on economic development and trade related to the OECD and G20 work on the global digital tax or minimum tax that are being discussed as well. I mean, in an ideal world, there would also be a discussion on a global carbon tax in the same framework, but I think we're not there yet, and there's too much complications. But that's a question from one of our viewers.
This is a great question. One of the big achievements at the G20 Ministers of Finance and Central Bank Governors meeting in Venice in this month was the agreement to move with a minimal corporate tax, and also to look in ways in which taxing digital companies and services would be fairer and in a way supporting the recovery from this crisis. The IMF has for a long time advocated for minimal corporate tax to avoid race to the bottom and to avoid hiding money from the citizens of the countries where the tax should be received. As we are now coming to hopefully the recovery from the pandemic, countries are going to be faced with high deficits and high debt, and it would be paramount to secure the revenues that allow the support for the recovery and also medium-term fiscal sustainability. So we welcome wholeheartedly the agreement on minimal corporate tax, and we welcome progress that has been made on discussing a digital tax. As you know, US moved to impose a kind of response to digital taxation in 6 countries, but immediately suspended action for 180 days. Very good signal that we need some time to find a pathway to agreement, and hopefully we will. Before the pandemic, we used to say the future is digital. And with the pandemic, the future has arrived. It is not anymore possible to set aside the question of how we tax digital services. Neither we can set aside the question of what we do about digital commerce. So in the trade negotiations, in the tax negotiations, as difficult as these questions may be, we have to find a pathway forward. And we at the IMF, we offer our analytical services. The fact that we do surveillance of 190 countries as a good input in these discussions. So decisions can be well informed and countries can see themselves being treated fairly.
Now, this is certainly something that could be historical. I mean, with so many countries from across the world being involved in this, and if there's a possibility to agree, this could certainly set the tone for other agreements as well in the future. So I think there are reasons to be optimistic, even if there's still a lot of technicalities and lots of issues left to solve as well. Kristalina, I know that you have another meeting very soon. You've been very generous with your time. So thank you so much. I just wanted to give you a couple of minutes to finish. We touched so many times about increased cooperation and new alliances being formed, and maybe this crisis can come something good out of it with sort of revitalization of the multilateral system. And I know that IMF works so closely with not only WHO, but also WTO, which is in great need of reform and modernization. Dr. Ngozi and her team are doing their best. How do you, very briefly, because this is of course something we could talk hours about, how do you see the multilateral system emerging after this pandemic, after the crisis?
The pandemic has reminded us how interdependent we are, how much we rely on each other. And it has opened up more avenues for cooperation exactly because of this recognition of our interdependence. Many of us worried before in the early months of the pandemic that the climate agenda will fall off the cliff because we are so concentrated on health. That did not happen. If anything, we are seeing a renewed impetus to cooperate. And let me talk about trade, because this is an area where the world can benefit tremendously if progress is made. We know that, especially since 2016, there has been a reversal on many counts in the area of trade. New restrictions put in place, and we have to admit, while some restrictions are removed, many of those that have been introduced since 2016 are still in place. They're holding us back. We have about 10% of GDP being, in fact, put on under delivery because of trade restrictions. So history tells us trade is good for growth, for jobs, for poverty reduction. But it also tells us that it is difficult to bring all interests of all countries together. When I think of the future that Dr. Ngozi is going to be leading in WTO, I see the good and I see the difficult. The good is that in the context of this pandemic, there is a renewed engagement of the membership. We see a very progressive attitude in many places towards wrestling with the difficult questions. But at the same time, we are quite slow to make progress. Just take the most recent discussions around fisheries subsidies. It is considered one of the easier areas to reach an agreement, and yet agreement is hard to reach. So since your question is, how do I see the future? I see definitely a very important role for collaboration internationally. In actually, it is paramount that we have it. And I see a very, very important role for leadership in international organizations to prove every day that they serve the interest of people around the world by making progress on these difficult issues. And in that sense, I want to finish on my very best wishes to Ngozi. Like you, she's an old friend, a woman who has proven in her life not to shy away from difficulties, but also to be able to bring people together. That she succeeds. In the end of this year, there would be a very important ministerial meeting. That she succeeds to do exactly that, pragmatically make progress and prove that the collective, the strength of the collective is there.
Thank you so much. I think we can join you in wishing her good luck, and also you good luck with your vaccine alliance and the work that IMF is doing. You've been very generous with your time, Kristalina. So many questions we could talk about for hours. I know you have a busy day. Thank you all for tuning in. Many of the questions you put have been addressed already in the remarks by Kristalina, and sorry for not being able to taking all of them. You can tune in also the 18th of August, the next Trade Winds. We will be talking about the African Continental Free Trade Area, another very exciting subject. So thank you all for coming. Thank you so much, Kristalina and Georgieva, for giving your and IMF's views on this. Have a good afternoon, evening, or morning, wherever you are.
Thank you.